My name is Amelia Vance, and for the last 10 years, my life has been a quiet rebellion that no one, least of all my own family, ever noticed. They saw me as the quaint, slightly lost art historian, the one with the charity hobby, while my older brother, Julian, was the sun around which our family's universe revolved. He was the titan of industry, the museum chairman, the golden child whose every move was celebrated. And tonight was supposed to be his coronation. He was hosting a gala to announce the new museum wing being named in his honor, a monument to his ego built with money he didn't even have. He seated me at table 52, in the back, by the kitchens. He thought he was putting me in my place, making me invisible. But my brother never learned the most important lesson about art. The person in the shadows is often the one controlling the light. He had absolutely no idea that my charity hobby, the anonymous foundation I built from the ground up, was the primary donor for his precious wing. And he certainly didn't know that my donation came with a morality clause so sharp it could cut a legacy to ribbons. In a few hours, I would walk onto that stage, and with a few simple, honest words, I would revoke the entire grant because of his deeply unethical business practices. The Julian Vance wing would be dismantled before the first brick was ever laid. He thought tonight was his victory lap. He had no idea it was his public execution, and I was holding the axe. Before I dive into the story of how a backtable charity case brought down a millionaire's monument to himself, I want to know where you're all watching from. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever been underestimated or had your passion dismissed by the people who were supposed to support you the most, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe to join our community of people who know that the quietest voices can often make the most powerful statements. Now let's get into it. My entire childhood was an education in being secondary. In the Vance household, there were two roles, Julian, the future, and Amelia, the scenery. Julian was all sharp angles and loud proclamations, his achievements hung on the walls like masterpieces. His first grade report card, with its neat row of A's, was framed and placed on the piano. My first painting, a swirling, impressionistic watercolor of our garden that had won a small local competition, was praised for 5 minutes with a distracted pat on the head before being put away for safekeeping, which meant it was slid under a stack of magazines in the study, never to be seen again. I was 7. I remember the exact texture of the paper, the way the cerulean blue bled into the viridian green to make the perfect shade for the hydrangea bushes. I remembered the pride hot and bright in my chest when the judge, a woman with kind, crinkly eyes, had told me I had a special gift for seeing the world's color. That pride dissolved into a cool, familiar ache when my father held up Julian's report card at dinner that night. "Now this," he'd boomed, his voice resonating with a genuine, booming admiration I had never heard directed at me. "This is a foundation for success. Math, science reading. This is the stuff that builds empires, son." Julian, who was 9, puffed out his chest and nodded seriously, as if he were already a tiny king surveying his future kingdom. My mother had smiled, her gaze fixed on Julian. "He has your mind, darling," she'd said to my father. I had mentioned my blue ribbon. "That's lovely, sweetie," my mother had said, her eyes still on Julian. "Maybe you can paint a picture of your brother's report card." They had laughed. It wasn't malicious, not in the way a villain in a story is malicious. It was worse. It was casual unthinking, a complete and total eclipse of my existence by the sheer gravitational pull of my brothers. This pattern didn't just continue, it calcified. As we grew older, the distinctions became sharper. Julian's path was a brightly lit superhighway, paved with our parents' expectations and investments. His summer camps were for coding and leadership. Mine were for pottery and sketching. His high school graduation gift was a sedan. Mine was a new set of acrylic paints and a well-intentioned but deeply patronizing book titled, "So You Want to Be an Artist?" When he chose to major in finance at an Ivy League university, my parents threw a lavish party. They spoke of his future in hushed, reverent tones, mapping out his trajectory from analyst to partner to CEO. When I announced my decision to study art history at the same university, a thoughtful silence fell over the dinner table. My father had cleared his throat, swirling the wine in his glass. "Art history," he'd repeated, the words tasting foreign and slightly unpleasant in his mouth. "And what does one do with that, exactly? Curate a gallery?" The word gallery was pronounced with the same faint disdain one might use for rodent infestation. Julian had snorted. "She can be a docent, Dad. You know, the people who follow you around the museum telling you not to touch things." I had tried to explain. I talked about the Renaissance, about the Medici family, and how their patronage didn't just fund art, but shaped the entire political and cultural landscape of Europe. I spoke with a passion that felt like a fire in my throat, trying to make them see the complex, thrilling world I saw, a world of history and power and beauty all woven together. It's not just about pretty pictures, I'd said, my voice pleading. It's about the why. Why was this made? Who paid for it? What does it tell us about who we were, and who we are? My mother had offered a thin, placating smile. That's very interesting, dear. It's so nice you have a hobby you're so passionate about. A hobby. For years of rigorous academic study, of learning to read Latin and Italian, of memorizing the lineages of popes and kings, of deconstructing the iconography of 1,000 altarpieces. All of it reduced to a hobby. A pleasant little pastime, like knitting or collecting stamps. Julian had simply shaken his head, a smirk playing on his lips, as if my entire life's ambition was a charming but ultimately silly joke. The conversation had then, as it always did, shifted back to him, to his internship on Wall Street, to his bright, shining, understandable future. I had sat there, a ghost at my own family table, the fire in my throat turning to ash. There was one person who saw the fire and wasn't afraid of its heat. My grandmother, Elena. She was my mother's mother, a woman who seemed to be made of different, more vibrant material than the rest of my family. While they were all muted earth tones, Elena was cadmium yellow and cobalt blue. She had been a librarian, not a painter, but she treated books and art with the same sacred reverence. Her apartment was a cozy, sun-drenched haven filled with overflowing bookshelves, reproductions of Klimt and Cassatt tacked to the walls, and the constant, comforting scent of old paper and brewing tea. When I was a child, she never gave me coloring books with prescribed lines. She gave me vast, blank sheets of paper. "The world gives you enough lines to stay within, mia cara," she would say, her accent a soft, melodic echo from her Italian childhood. "In here," she'd tap my forehead, and in here, she'd tap my chest, "you should have no lines at all." She was the one who took me to museums, not as a chore, but as an adventure. She wouldn't just point at a painting and read the plaque. She'd ask questions. "Look at her hands, Emilia. What do you think she was doing right before the painter captured her? Look at the light. Is it morning or evening? What does that light feel like on your skin?" She taught me to see art not as a static object, but as a living conversation across centuries. She was the only one who understood that my passion wasn't a hobby. "To understand art," she told me once, her hand cool on my cheek, "is to understand the soul of a people. Finance tells you what people owned. Art tells you what they loved, what they feared, what they dreamed of. Do not ever let anyone tell you that is unimportant." When she passed away during my junior year of college, the light in my world dimmed. She left me what little she had, her collection of art books and a modest inheritance of $50,000. To my family, it was a negligible sum, a footnote in their balance sheets. To me, it was everything. It was the seed. After graduation, while Julian was climbing the corporate ladder in New York, leaving a trail of broken deals and intimidated rivals in his wake, I moved to a small apartment in a less fashionable part of the city and began to build. The idea for the Meridian Trust wasn't a grand, sudden vision. It was a slow, quiet coalescing of my grief for Elena and my frustration with the art world my brother and parents so admired. A world of ostentatious galas, of art as an investment vehicle, of museum wings named after corporate raiders. I wanted to create something that embodied Elena's philosophy. That art was for everyone, that it should nurture the soul, not just decorate the portfolios of the rich. With her $50,000, I legally established the foundation. I named it the Meridian Trust, after the imaginary line that connects the poles, a symbol of connection over vast, empty spaces. For the first 2 years, it was just me in my spare bedroom, which I called an office. I spent my days in libraries, researching tax law and philanthropic best practices. I spent my nights writing grant proposals, not to receive them, but to understand how to give them. I started small. My first grant was for $500 to a community arts program for at-risk youth in the Bronx. It bought them a new kiln. I received a handwritten thank you card with a picture of the lopsided, gloriously imperfect pots the children had made. I framed it and hung it over my desk. It was my first A+ report card. Over the next decade, I worked tirelessly, and I worked anonymously. Anonymity was my shield. It protected me from my family's ridicule, and more importantly, it kept the focus where it belonged, on the work. I had a knack for it. My art history background made me uniquely skilled at identifying artists and projects with immense cultural value but little commercial appeal. I became a silent partner to the avant-garde, the subversive, the artists who were asking difficult questions. I built a small, trusted board, led by a semi-retired lawyer named Arthur Hastings, a man with a gentle demeanor and a mind like a steel trap. He was a friend of Elena's, and he understood my mission implicitly. We found other like-minded donors who were tired of the Gallian-Plaque model of philanthropy and were drawn to our discreet, impactful approach. My inheritance was the seed, but their contributions were the water and sunlight. The Meridian Trust grew. Quietly, steadily, its assets swelled from thousands to millions. My family, of course, knew nothing. To them, I was still just Amelia, puttering away at my charity work, a euphemism for being unemployed and unmarried. They'd ask about it at obligatory holiday dinners. "So, how is the foundation coming along, dear?" My mother would ask, her tone dripping with forced interest. "Are you helping the starving artists?" Julian would laugh his booming laugh. "Still giving away your lunch money, Leah? I just closed a 7-figure deal to acquire a biotech firm. We're going to revolutionize gene therapy." He would say it without a hint of irony, as if closing a business deal was morally equivalent to curing cancer. "That's wonderful, Julian," I would say, my voice even. And I'd let them believe I was small. I let them believe I was insignificant. Their condescension was the price of my freedom. It was the wall behind which I was building my own, very different kind of empire. Then came the museum. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the very institution my grandmother and I had treated as a second home, announced a major expansion project. They needed to build a new wing for their collection of modern and contemporary art. My father was on the board, and Julian, through a series of aggressive donations and backroom handshakes, had recently been appointed chairman. The project was his baby, his stepping stone from the world of business into the rarefied air of cultural royalty. They put out a public call for a lead donor, a single entity to provide the cornerstone grant of $25 million. The wing would be named after the benefactor. When I saw the announcement, something shifted in me. This wasn't a small community project. This was the heart of the art world. This was the place Elena had taught me to love. The idea was audacious, almost unthinkable. But the Meridian Trust could do it. We had the capital. A donation of this size would be transformative, not just for the museum, but for us. It would allow us to insist on programming that aligned with our values. Free admission days, robust educational outreach, and dedicated galleries for emerging, underrepresented artists. It was a chance to inject Elena's spirit directly into the institution's veins. I brought the proposal to my board. Arthur was the most skeptical. "Amelia, you know who is running this show," he said, peering at me over his glasses. "Your brother. Your father. Do you really want to get into bed with them, even anonymously?" "That's the point, Arthur," I argued. "Anonymity gives us all the power. They won't know it's me. We'll be a ghost at their table. We can shape the project from the inside, and they'll be none the wiser." He was still hesitant, so I directed him to the clause that would become my secret weapon. "And we will insist on our standard morality clause. Ironclad. No exceptions." The clause was something Arthur himself had drafted for me years ago. It stipulated that the funds were contingent upon the recipient institution and its key leadership, namely the board and chairman, maintaining the highest ethical standards, both personally and professionally. Any conduct that brought the institution into public disrepute would be grounds for immediate and total revocation of the grant. At the time, it seemed like standard due diligence, a way to protect the foundation's integrity. Arthur read it again, and a slow smile spread across his face. "It's very tight, Amelia. If he so much as gets a speeding ticket, and it hits the papers, you could pull the plug." "He's my brother, Arthur," I had said, perhaps naively. "He's arrogant, but he's not a criminal. This is just a safety net." The board approved it. Arthur handled the negotiations through a labyrinth of legal intermediaries. The museum, desperate for the funds, barely blinked at the clause, seeing it as boilerplate. The deal was signed. The transfer was made. And just like that, I became the secret patron of my own brother's monument to himself. I felt a strange, thrilling sense of power, a quiet satisfaction. I had no idea that the safety net I had so carefully woven was about to be tested in the most spectacular way imaginable. The first tremor was a faint vibration, a tiny article buried deep in an online business journal. The headline was innocuous: "Vance Capital under scrutiny for downtown development project." I clicked on it, my heart giving a strange little lurch. The article was short on details, mostly speculation. It mentioned a property deal Julian's firm had pushed through, a large parcel of land slated for luxury condos. It hinted at displaced tenants and questions about zoning changes that had been approved with unusual speed. I read it twice. It was probably nothing, just the kind of muckraking that follows any powerful man. But I saved the link anyway. It felt like finding a single, unfamiliar footprint in the snow. A few weeks later, I was at my parents' house for our obligatory Sunday brunch, a ritual of stilted conversation and perfectly cooked eggs Benedict. Julian was holding court, of course, describing in great detail the architectural plans for his wing. He had unrolled a massive blueprint across the dining table, ignoring the fact that my mother had just set down a platter of fruit. "You see here," he said, jabbing a finger at the paper. "This is where the grand staircase will be. Marble, imported from Italy. And the entire west wall will be glass, overlooking the park. It's all about the statement." My father was beaming, his chest puffed out with pride. "A true legacy, son. A Vance legacy." I saw my opening, a small gap in the wall of their adoration. "Speaking of your projects, Julian," I said, my voice deliberately casual. "I saw a small article online about that new downtown development. It mentioned some questions about the zoning. The effect was instantaneous. The warm, self-congratulatory atmosphere in the room chilled by 10 degrees. Julian's eyes, which had been bright with excitement, hardened into chips of ice. "What are you talking about?" "Just an article," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It mentioned something about the tenants in the old building." My mother immediately jumped in, her voice sharp with annoyance. "Amelia, for heaven's sake, don't be so naive. When you're as successful as your brother, people will always try to tear you down. It's jealousy, pure and simple." "She reads that internet gossip," my father said, waving a dismissive hand as if shooing away a fly. "You should know better, Amelia. Your brother is building things, creating value. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs." The cliché hung in the air, grotesque in its application to people's homes and lives. Julian finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Listen to me, Leah. You stick to your little paintings and your charity cases. You don't have the stomach or the intellect for the real world. That gossip is the sound of progress. It's the sound of me winning. Don't ever bring it up again." He rolled up the blueprint with a sharp snap, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. The conversation was over. But I had my answer. It wasn't just the words he said, it was the fury behind them. It was the panicked, cornered look in his eyes that he had tried so desperately to conceal. The footprint in the snow was no longer alone. It was the beginning of a trail, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, where it was leading. I decided to have a conversation with Julian directly, one last attempt to appeal to a sliver of conscience I hoped still existed. I cornered him after a board meeting at the museum, a neutral ground where I hoped he'd be on his best behavior. He was striding down a long marble hallway, barking orders into his phone. He saw me and his face tightened. "Amelia, I'm busy. I just need 5 minutes, Julian," I said, falling into step beside him. He sighed dramatically and ended his call. 5 minutes. The clock is ticking. We stopped in a small, empty gallery filled with abstract sculptures. The silence felt heavy. "I'm worried about you," I began, the words feeling foreign and inadequate. "This story about the development, it's not just internet gossip anymore. I saw a local news report. They interviewed some of the families who were evicted. They were compensated," he snapped, his jaw tight. "They were paid more than the apartments were worth. They weren't just apartments, Julian. They were homes. One woman had lived there for 40 years. They gave her 30 days to leave. That's business, Amelia. It's not my job to be a social worker. My responsibility is to my investors. A concept I'm sure is completely alien to you. My foundation is an investor," I said softly. "A different kind of investor. We invest in people, in communities. We believe that has value." He actually laughed, a short, barking sound that echoed off the cold marble. "Oh, please. Don't get on your high horse with me. You and your little Meridian Trust. It's a joke. A tax write-off for your bleeding heart friends. You're playing with pocket money in the kiddie pool, Leah. I'm in the ocean with sharks. Now, if you're done with your little lecture, I have a wing to get built." He turned to leave, but I stepped in front of him. "What if the sharks come for you, Julian? What if the full story comes out? It could damage the museum. It could damage everything." For a split second, I saw it again, that flicker of fear in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a towering wall of arrogance. "Nothing can touch me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Especially not you." He brushed past me, his shoulder deliberately bumping mine, and walked away, leaving me alone with the silent, twisting forms of the sculptures. The conversation had been a failure, but it had also been a clarification. There was no conscience left to appeal to. He had walled it up, brick by brick, with money and ego and ambition. He truly believed he was untouchable. And in that moment, I knew that if the story broke, I would have no choice. The safety net wasn't for him anymore. It was for the art. It was for Elena's memory. 2 weeks before the gala, the bomb detonated. It wasn't a small online journal or a local news segment. It was a 6-page, front-page spread in the Sunday edition of the New York Times. The headline was stark: "The Architect of Displacement. How Julian Vance gamed the system and built an empire on ruin." The investigative journalist had done their homework. It was all there, laid out in meticulous, damning detail. Forged documents. Insider trading with a city planning official. A shell corporation used to intimidate the low-income, mostly elderly, residents of the building he wanted to demolish. The article featured heartbreaking interviews with the displaced tenants, people who had lost not just their homes but their communities. It included a leaked internal memo from Julian's company with a subject line that read, "Aggressive Tenant Mitigation Strategy." It detailed a campaign of harassment, of cutting off heat in the winter, of fabricating code violations to force people out. It wasn't just unethical. It was monstrous. It was predatory and cruel. The story was accompanied by a large, glossy photograph of Julian, smiling confidently at a charity event, the very picture of a civic leader. The juxtaposition made me physically ill. I spread the newspaper out on the floor of my small office, the same office where the framed picture of the children's lopsided pots hung on the wall. The two images, the photograph of my brother's smiling, predatory face and the picture of those innocent, joyful creations, represented two different universes. His world was about taking, about demolishing, about a legacy built on the rubble of other people's lives. Mine, the one Elena had inspired, was about building, about nurturing, about creating something beautiful where there was nothing. The morality clause in my foundation's contract wasn't just a legal technicality anymore. It was a sacred vow. To ignore this, to let his name be chiseled into the walls of the museum we both grew up in, would be the ultimate betrayal of everything I had built and everything I believed in. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone to call Arthur. He answered on the second ring. "I've seen it," he said, his voice grim. There was no need for preamble. "It's worse than we could have imagined, Amelia." "The clause, Arthur," I said, my voice tight. "Tell me again. Is it ironclad?" "It is a fortress," he replied, his tone firm and reassuring. "The language is unambiguous. Any action by the key leadership, including the chairman, which brings the institution into public disrepute, or is found to be in violation of local or federal law, or is otherwise determined to be ethically compromised by the trust's board, constitutes a material breach of this agreement." It goes on to state that upon such a breach, the trust has the sole and absolute discretion to demand the immediate return of all granted funds and to revoke any and all naming rights associated with the grant. He paused. "You hold all the cards, Amelia. The board will back any decision you make. We can send a letter tomorrow morning. It will be quiet, professional. By the end of the day, the funding will be pulled, and the museum will issue a quiet press release." I looked across my office at the invitation that had arrived just a few days earlier. It was sitting on the corner of my desk, a rectangle of thick, creamy cardstock. "The Board of Trustees and our chairman, Mr. Julian Vance, request the pleasure of your company at a gala celebrating the unveiling of the Julian Vance wing." And inside the seating card, my name neatly printed on it, Ms. Amelia Vance, Table 52. The back of the room. The place for insignificant relatives and minor business associates. They had spent a decade making me feel invisible. A quiet, professional letter wasn't enough. They didn't deserve a quiet exit. They deserved to see the ghost they had ignored for so long step into the light. "No," I said, my voice suddenly clear and steady, the shaking in my hands gone. "No letter." "Amelia?" Arthur asked, a note of confusion in his voice. "I'm going to the gala, Arthur," I said, my eyes fixed on the invitation. "He wants to stand on that stage and thank his anonymous donor. So I'm going to go. And I'm going to let him." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in Arthur's brilliant legal mind. Then I heard him take a deep, slow breath. "My God, Amelia," he whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "You're going to do it in person. He deserves a statement. I said, my voice cold as stone. A public one. I could hear the faint sound of a smile in Arthur's voice. I'll have a car waiting for you outside the venue, he said. For afterwards. The decision was made. The die was cast. I was no longer a ghost. I was a reckoning.